Hello, everyone, and welcome to today's webinar, Looking Back to See Ahead, A History of Network Device Threats. My name is Melissa Russell, and I'll be the host for today's webinar. Before we get started, I just want to go over a few housekeeping items. We are going to be recording this session, and we will make the slides and the recording available within the next day or so. If you do have any questions, please go ahead and throw them into the Q&A chat, and we will save a little bit of time at the end in order to take some questions. At this time, I'd like to go ahead and introduce our speakers. I am joined today by Nate Warfield, who is our Director of Threat Research, and Tyson Supasada, who is our Director of Product Marketing. At the time, the floor is all yours. Go ahead, Tyson.
Thanks, Melissa. Yeah, I'll just get right into it. In the webinar today, we're gonna talk about the timeline that Eclipsium was put together. We're going to call out notable threats, especially in the last 3 years. And then we'll go over some lessons learned and some trends that we can take away. We'll talk a little bit about why patching for network infrastructure is so difficult. And then we're going to talk about supply chain intelligence, or how market forces can help improve network device security. Okay, so just getting straight into it, Eclipsium has a solution for helping to harden network devices, and also detect threats, in addition to laptops and servers. But what we noticed last year is things just went off the rails in terms of the attacks against network devices. It was and it ended with Citrix Bleed at the end of last year, and so many large organizations were getting hit with ransomware through Citrix Bleed. And then even we saw again in January of this year, the Ivanti Connect Secure, formerly known as Pulse Secure, it's ongoing, an ongoing situation with Ivanti. So what we did is we put together just a timeline going back to 2005, and just mapping out how we got to this point where we are today. And with that, I'm gonna switch the screen that I'm sharing, and then so I'm going to be looking at here we are. Okay. Yeah. So Nate, I'll just scroll down, and you tell me, tell me what we're looking at here, basically.
Yeah. So I apologize. It's the winter in the Pacific Northwest. Everybody has a cough. So what we're looking at here, and I think the thing that's important to highlight is let's keep it up at the top a little bit there, Tyson.
Oh yeah.
I want to kind of cover just the high level timeline. So the thing that really we tried to capture here is the evolution of these types of attacks, right? It's not that they're new per se, but it's that I forget the rootkit from 2005, because that was like a lifetime ago. But as we go back, there was some instances of Cisco rootkits. Most of these were nation state actors. They were either Russian spy agencies or maybe American spy agencies, and that kind of came really to a head, or should I say to the forefront, in 2016 and in 2017, where in I think it was August of 2016, this sort of shadowy group that called themselves the Shadow Brokers basically said, we have a pile of toys from the NSA that we've stolen. We want to sell it. I think they were auctioning off for like $50 million in Bitcoin. And their way of proving to the world that they actually had something worth, paying for, was to release a set of the NSA's toys that they were using against network devices. So there was exploits for, I think, Fortinet, for Cisco, for Juniper. There was backdoor tools that they built for these devices. And now, while a lot of these didn't see a lot of widespread exploitation, I think just because at the time attackers the focus wasn't on the network side of things. They were still having plenty of success getting in through phishing and through malicious links, or finding Windows servers that hadn't been patched. We roll forward a little bit into 2017, and then I forget the guy's name, but he decides to leak all of the CIA's toys or a bunch of CIA's toys, and it turns out the CIA also had some stuff that they've been using against network devices. So we're still in the world where it's nation states. It's, you know, it's threat actors that are government funded, that have a lot of money and resources. But as we scroll, I think yeah, we can just kind of just touch on these here. Just leave it right there is perfect. So as we, you know, as we go into 2020, as the pandemic was starting to kick off, right in the you know, before everybody had started working from home, in around January, there was a Citrix vulnerability that had kind of gone unnoticed. It was disclosed in December of 2019, and it wasn't really picked up until a researcher did a blog about it and pointed out just how easy this thing was to exploit. It was just a path traversal. That sort of was, in my opinion, one of the kickoff points. Some could argue that there was a Pulse VPN vulnerability from, I believe, 2018, 2019. But those two started getting more widespread exploitation. In the summer, we see this F51 that was pretty widely exploited. But at the time, most of these, the F51, a lot of people were seeing it was more just kind of script kiddies dropping Monero miners, or there was some exploratory tools that were being used. But it wasn't at the state that we're at today. And I don't want to spend a lot of time on the rest of these because we're going to go in more in detail farther down. So let's go ahead.
Okay.
Yeah, so the Black Hat was the 2005 one. So this is theoretical, right? This is, I can do it. It's possible. Is it actually being used in the wild? Probably not. And yeah, this is a laundry list, so we don't want to necessarily go through every single one.
Right.
So because really the thing is that this attack, what used to be sort of the domain of the nation states, the domain of the very advanced threat actors, the bar is continually being lowered. Yeah, we'll go into 2020 is perfect. This is where we really started to see this stuff taking off. And in fact, the group that I'd started in 2020, the CTI League, that was actually one of these network vulnerabilities were sort of the impetus behind starting the group, was we found all of these hospitals that actually were vulnerable to the Citrix vulnerability that I mentioned. So we spent a lot of time trying to notify hospitals and going through like the healthcare ISAC or the ISAC groups to get the word out saying, hey, you've got edge devices that can easily be breached. These are VPN devices that will give people full access to your hospital network. There had been one published incident in, I think it was late February, early March, of a hospital in Germany that had been ransomwared. So this kind of progressed through the summer. There was a lot of work that went on. You can scroll down a little bit here. So yeah, okay, this is about good. And then what was interesting is that, you know, initially nobody thought, I mean, I guess people didn't realize just how insidious ransomware gangs were going to get. If we roll the clock forward in 2022, I think it was around September, October, there was a focused campaign against healthcare networks by the ransomware gangs. Like they even went so far as to say, we're going to specifically attack as many hospitals and healthcare networks as we can, because in the middle of a global pandemic, you know, a hospital is essentially critical infrastructure. And, you know, bad guys being bad guys, they say, well, if, you know, of all the places that's going to pay a ransom, you know, ransomwaring a school in 2020 is probably not going to be as lucrative as ransomware a hospital in 2020. And yeah, and we can scroll down a little bit here. And this is, CISA starts to pick up. They start to notice this stuff. They're starting to see that, you know, we started to see the Chinese state actors using these things. And it was sort of like the floodgates had opened, right? People, all of a sudden, these threat actors realized there's all these devices out there. You know, they've been spending, you know, countless amounts of research time and money on finding new 0 days in browsers, in Windows, and, you know, not so much like the phones really, because it's not it's not a great entry point into an organization. But all of a sudden, I believe that there was this sort of light bulb moment where they said, wait a second, like we're focusing our efforts on the wrong things. We should be going after these appliances, because unlike trying to throw an exploit at a Windows desktop, you have to either get someone to click on a link and hope that they visit the page with the ODay on it. You have to get them to open an attachment. There's more complexity with exploiting Windows than a VPN device, which by its very nature has to be internet exposed, right? You can't not internet expose your VPN endpoints. So this is where we start to see, as we come down, this Pulse Secure VPNs getting hit. F5 has another bunch of vulnerabilities, and then this is still a lot of the ransomware gangs, right? This was them using stuff that don't, as far as we know, they were not developing these 0 days themselves. Like the F5 vulnerability from 2020 was, it was responsibly disclosed, or I should say it was disclosed to the vendor. They released a patch, but InfoSec community being InfoSec community, people decided, hey, let's build a POC, put it out on, I think it was Rapid7's Metasploit, which was the first one. And within hours of that being published is when we started to see this wide scale like exploitation campaign happening. They didn't need to hunt 0 days themselves, because they were just being, researchers like myself and like others that do this, we're finding it, disclosing it, and then as soon as the patch comes out, of course, someone pulls it down and patch diffs and realizes that not only is it a bad vuln, but they're trivial, right? The F5 one from 2020 was also path traversal like Citrix was. None of these were really hard to exploit when we talk about the bar of difficulty and exploitation, right? With Windows, as Microsoft has spent billions of dollars making Windows a very hardened target, nobody's done that with these devices.
Yeah. I just wanted to let the audience know that this PDF is available on our blog. So we do have a blog, and you can access the PDF from there. And I can't promise, but we will try our best to keep this timeline updated. And then down at the bottom of the infographic or the PDF are actual references to either like CISA or FBI advisories or reputable news sources, so you can, or incident reports where you can read the details about these.
Yep. Yeah, so thanks for that, Tyson. So a lot of these, like I said, these hackers are publishing credentials. So this starts to get into the sense of it's similar to like what you see with initial access brokers, where they're getting in and they're selling access to people. These hackers are saying, okay, well, if I can get on a Fortinet device, which is, generally a VPN device of some sort, they say, okay, well, I can either harvest credentials if they're using some sort of maybe local accounts, or because a lot of these things are talking to Active Directory on the back end, they can use their same sort of tools for harvesting Active Directory credentials, or laterally move inside the network from the appliance and start dumping credentials. So it's it's my favorite place to set up shop on a network personally. All right, so if we come down here, okay, so 2022, it's going to continue to accelerate. This F5 one is one of my personal favorite vulnerabilities. I have this sort of thing for vulnerabilities that fit in a tweet, and this is another one of them. It essentially gave you full shell access. You could run any command, any bash command you wanted as root, simply by tampering with the header of an HTTP request against its management address. You just said the call is coming from inside the house. Essentially, you told it that the request came from localhost. The device says, "Cool, I don't need to authenticate you. You can run whatever commands you want." It was actually very, very cool vulnerability. And this one, of course, has been used. I don't have the list of companies that have been breached, but this one has been referenced in many times of, yes, a company was breached with ransomware. It was believed that their F5 device was the cause of it. Some of the working groups I'm in, people will go and we'll see a breach happen, and then we can go and use tools like Shodan to look at their perimeter and say, yes, here, they've got an F5 device here, or there's a Citrix device here. Like, this is a very likely place that was the entry point to get in here. Another interesting thing that we don't cover here because it's not a specific attack, but right around the same time that this F5 vulnerability came out, Mandiant had released a report on a threat actor that they initially had called UNC 3524. They have since updated that to believe it's APT29, or also known as Cozy Bear, one of the Russian state actors. And they had discovered that this actor was setting up shop on, while they didn't name the vendors, they said, these load balancers and VPN concentrators that run Linux or BSD. And for the uninitiated, Citrix runs BSD and F5 runs Linux. But these attackers are able to have like a 1.5 years or more dwell time on a network because nobody could see that they were there. Right? They knew they'd been breached. They were doing their IR stuff. And only once they finally managed to track back, like, where did this attack originate from? All of a sudden they realize it's coming off of their network device. which is why attackers are liking this. They can live there almost indefinitely as long as they don't make too much noise. Nobody's going to notice that they're on that device itself.
There's not a lot of threat detection capabilities.
There's basically zero threat detection on most of these things, even as we're seeing with Avanti or with the Cisco campaign last year or Citrix Bleed. There's very little to go off of if you don't already know exactly what you're looking for. And these devices are by and large kind of, even though they're Linux and BSD, which I'm sure more than a few of our audience members are familiar with, the networking teams that manage these, and having been a network engineer for about 17 years before I switched to security, I can tell you that network engineering, they're very good at what they do, which is, setting up networks and doing BGP and all of these other things. But security beyond, let's firewall these things off, let's put on ACLs, that's kind of as far as it goes. These devices have historically not had to be security patched like Windows. So it's also a core of the network. It's something that's mission critical. You don't, if it's, if it ain't broke, don't fix it. So that's kind of how they've been able to get away and live so long on these things.
Yeah. And this is in 2023. So last year, this is where we start breaking it out by month, just because it was a crazy year.
There's so many of them. So yeah, the 2023 was interesting. It was eye-opening, and I unfortunately think it sort of set the stage for what we're going to see this year. But Fortinet had just a slew of vulnerabilities that were found we've switched now from even the F5, the one from 2022, that was also like disclosed by a security researcher. So, the attackers didn't have to do R&D to find 0 days. Now, that's not to say that they weren't. Finding 0 days is not necessarily the most easy thing to do. And some of these devices, Fortinet, for example, Pulse Secure is another good example. Most of the firewall companies make it very, very hard to actually analyze the firmware on their device. They will lock out the shells. There won't be a full shell, or it's been restricted to only do configuration things. So you can't go poking around and seeing what processes and daemons are running, what version of Apache they might be using for their GUI. Or they encrypt the entire file system so that, even if you get a firmware image from the vendor, you can't just unpack it and start poking around in it. It's usually got some sort of a hardware key on the device that decrypts the firmware as it boots up. And I have some fairly strong opinions about this. I believe in some sense they think that this is a way of either protecting their intellectual property, or it sounds good to their customers. And they say, hey, don't worry. The whole operating system is encrypted. Nobody can get to it. That's not true. If anything, it's hindering the responsible research community from being able to go in and do essentially is free penetration testing. Like all of these vulnerability disclosures, nobody's charging these companies to do it. We're doing it because, one, it's fun. And some people like to have a bunch of CVEs to their name, but they're essentially saying, no, we don't want free testing, which is kind of absurd when you think about it.
Right. Yeah.
And it's not stopping anybody, right? The Chinese are buying devices. These actors are buying devices, or they're probably even made in China. They might just go walk into one of the manufacturers and say, hey, can we have this for a few months? And then, with enough time and effort, anybody can pull the firmware off and reverse engineer it. So they're doing this, they're finding all these 0 days. So in 2023, that's what we saw, was instead of it being end days where the patch comes out and then the vulnerability is figured out, it was, okay, there's 0 day attacks going on against all these Fortinet devices. By the time it's discovered, there's already hundreds or thousands of them that have been exploited.
Mm-hmm.
And then so we see this, another one. So Mirai was kind of been kicking around for a while. This is still a little bit of script kiddie stuff. I mean, it's kind of hard to call them exactly script kiddies because DDoSes can be used for state actor purposes, and they do rent the botnets out. But it's more annoying than it is specifically like damaging. You're not going to shut down. You're not going to, take an entire hospital network offline so that they can't process patient medical records or figure out which prescriptions might, if mixed together, kill someone. They're not going to stop that from happening by DDoSing their website off the internet.
Yeah.
Okay, so now we've got the energy firms. This was interesting. There's always that interesting difference, and I'll be talking about this later this month at a conference, but the motivations for these threat actors are unique, right? I'm not going to go into all of them, but the Russian threat actors generally seem to use, they've started to use cyber as sort of a component of kinetic warfare. That we saw this when they did a mass, basically bricking of satellite routers right before they went into Ukraine in 2022. They have done a lot of these, they're doing their sort of influence operations. It's interesting to see that they were going into energy firms, which, there's can be all sorts of speculation of, well, there's sanctions against Russian energy, and there's all of this sort of media around energy and the pipeline that was blown up and who did it. So it's not super surprising to see Russians going into power companies, as we obviously saw they've gotten into the Ukrainian power companies, a decade ago at this point. And then to that end, the Chinese threat actors who have somewhat been a little mysterious. There is obviously a lot of knowledge that they like to steal secrets. I think out there's a photo somewhere of the brand new Chinese fighter jet, and it looks basically it's like a clone of the F-35. So obviously they're getting in and they're stealing secrets. They're wanting to save themselves R&D time. But as the geopolitical situation in the Pacific has been, sort of Southeast Asia has been heating up around Taiwan, and I'm not going to get into politics, but there's the U.S., China, Japan, Taiwan, Hong Kong weird dynamic that's going on. And the Chinese have essentially been, as far as what is starting to look like with the report that came out yesterday, they've been setting up shop in critical infrastructure, and they've been specifically targeting U.S. military stuff in Guam, which is one of the larger military bases in the Pacific. I think they were looking at some stuff in Hawaii, which is another large military base for the United States, critical infrastructure. And it's somewhat of it's sort of like they're like, okay, they're making sure that things are prepared, right? Maybe as a deterrence factor. Are they being sloppy just to make sure that we know that we're there, that they're there, and that they can get in, right? Is this a sort of a cyber mutually assured destruction thing that we saw in the Cold War, right? They say, okay, we know the Chinese we know that they've been in one critical infra. That means they could, in theory, shut down electricity to us, shut down electricity to Guam, or shut down telecommunications between Hawaii and Guam, or what have you. That's a slippery slope, because I think most nations agree that that type of an attack on critical infrastructure is by and large considered an act of actual war. But it is sort of we can get to you, obviously they know we can get them. All right, so let's go interesting. So the Barracuda one was fun. I had done a research talk in 2022, and I'm not going to claim that it's my fault that this happened, but in talking with some folks from one of the incident response groups, I got an eyebrow raise. But I had basically done research on how you could burrow malware inside devices, and I was specifically targeting Citrix and F5, and abusing the way that their configuration backups work, and the fact that these are just essentially Linux or BSD systems. And a lot of times they're, when you back up the config to get a new device, it's really just creating like a tar file or just an archive of all the files in it. So I had showed, okay, it is possible to hide malware loaders inside config backups so that, if the device is replaced, it comes back. And it was interesting to see, 6 months later with Barracuda, the attacks, they started, it was once again a 0-day. I think Mandiant was one of the first to talk about it. And actually Mandiant, I believe, has even published that they saw within a matter of hours or like a day after their initial blog came out that the threat actors were going in and starting to change their backdoors that were on existing Barracuda devices, including adding functionality to their config backup that would restore the malware if you did, because Barracuda said you have to send them back to us if it's been breached. We can't guarantee that it's clean just by formatting it and reinstalling it. So they went the extra step of saying, let's bury our malware inside their config backups, because they have to back it up, and that way it would come back. So it was one of those, it's an interesting world, because as a security researcher, I mentioned the end day stuff where, a patch comes out and the researchers take it apart, they publish a POC, that POC then gets weaponized and used for wide scale exploitation. I don't have that on my conscience, but at a certain point there is like, okay, we're spending R&D efforts to show techniques, the goal being, let's make the world safer, let's help people prepare for this. But then, I didn't even think about Barracuda, and something that, maybe it was my idea, maybe it was simultaneously thought up. We'll never really know. But it's the point I'm making is that the actors are thinking the way we do. And the companies that build these things need to understand that what we're doing is not malicious, but what we're doing is basically identical to what they're doing. But if they figure it out first, it's going to be a bad day.
Right. And what was, I think, notable about this case is that the Barracuda basically asked their customers to, send the appliance back to us and we'll give you a new one.
Yeah.
Just to show like the level of compromise, like you said, tainting the configuration files and so
Yeah,
forth.
and I don't know that they knew that that was happening. I'm sure there was probably a few customers that had already made a device, put the new one in place, and suddenly we're like, wait, we've already been breached again. Did we just turn this thing back on? Somebody had to discover that they were burying the malware inside the backups. That wasn't just an accidental thing.
Yeah. So CISA started getting stern with federal agencies and gave them a binding operational directive to, hey, you either have to implement zero trust for these network, these management interfaces exposed to the internet, or you just, not expose them to the internet. So that was a good move, but it was a binding operational directive.
Yeah, and it has had some effect. You can scroll down, that's fine. So it had some effect. I know back in 2020, so back if we go back to early 2020, I think I know there was out of tens of thousands of the Net Citrix devices that were vulnerable, there was over 300 hospitals just in the United States that were vulnerable. We roll it forward to June of 2020 with the F5 one. I think when we first did a poll, there was 14,000 F5s across the world that have been exposed and were vulnerable. The number is continuing to drop though, like where most of this data is either used from like Shodan or Shadow Server. But we're starting to see, it's taken 4 years, but people are finally starting to pull the management interfaces for these things off of the public internet. So in that sense, it is getting a bit better. But as we go to July here with this NetScaler stuff, it doesn't matter because this NetScaler vulnerability was against the VPN endpoint, right? So 0 day, 30,000 devices. Obviously, the ransomware gangs are in there. The ransomware gangs are actually kind of, if you had to choose a company or an organization to breach you, it's almost better to have a ransomware gang do it because at least they're going to get in and you're going to know quickly because in a week or two, all of a sudden your machines are going to start locking up and you're going to say, pay the ransom. You get a Chinese threat actor on your network, they're not going to break anything. Their whole goal is to stay there and spy and do as much, whatever they need to do for as long as possible without getting caught. So at least the sort of mean time to detection is going to be smaller with the ransomware gang because boom, it's destroyed. Now, not to say that it's better to get ransomware than hacked by a state actor, but I think you see where I'm going with this.
Yeah, that's dark.
Yeah,
that's dark.
I'm fun at cocktail parties. So yeah, I don't want to go too much. We've been kind of harping on these, but we saw the same thing with Cisco, there's a vulnerability, tens of thousands of devices breached. The NSA and the government talk about this Chinese gang going after Cisco, Cisco routers, Cisco IOXE stuff comes out. I kind of jokingly called last year, I called it the summer of Citrix. The last one I want to talk about is Citrix, or maybe Citrix Bleed and possibly Avanti. The thing with Citrix Bleed, and this is one of the worst, in my opinion, one of the worst vulns and one of the worst responses that happened. Because as this thing was disclosed, the problem is that the vulnerability, without nerding out too much, it allowed you to steal session tokens for users that were logged in through the VPN. So if you'd logged in, put your multi-factor authentication in, doing all the things that we as InfoSec people say to do, you receive a session token. This is stored in your VPN client on your workstation, and it's probably not going to expire for a while, right? Because you're eventually, if you say, well, we expire this after an hour, the network team is going to get a call from the CEO saying, dude, I don't want to have to do this. I'm in China right now and I left my fob, and if my fob is at home or it's in the office. So they generally leave these session tokens to last for a very long time. Well, Citrix Bleed allow you to steal session tokens. The problem here was that the patch fixed the vulnerability, but if you had stolen session tokens that were valid when the device was vulnerable, patching it didn't nullify them. So you could patch it, reboot it, and they were still there. So if I had it, I could still get into through your now not vulnerable Citrix because the tokens were not invalidated. There was a secondary, you had to run like 2 commands to say, blow away all the session tokens, make everybody log back in. But Citrix didn't really tell people that initially. And it's something that quite literally could have been just wrapped into like the post install script. Like, okay, install the patch. And the last thing you do is run this command to blow away all the sessions and then reboot. So
And then-
organizations
yeah.
thought they were safe, still kept getting breached, including
Right.
all the ones we're talking about here. Comcast was another big ISP that got breached by Citrix Bleed. So yeah, it was
Yeah.
the problem is that these companies are not as used to dealing with security vulnerabilities as companies like Microsoft, who has been doing this for 20 years. And say what you will about them, they are very mature in their ability of patching security vulnerabilities.
I think one thing to know here is Citrix was purchased by I don't know if it's private equity or another group that kind of broke out the NetScaler group, and so I mean they could potentially have diminished resources to work on the response.
Yeah, and that parent company, like a couple months ago, announced that they're laying off like 20% of their staff. So that's always
Yeah.
a good look.
Yeah.
All right, let's close on Ivanti real quick. People are probably tired of hearing about this one, but this is another one that's just ugly. They patched a vulnerability. It was been easy to bypass. It's another VPN device. This one has even less. The ability to do forensics on this is even harder than on a NetScaler because it doesn't even have a shell. You can only use their graphical interface, and they do have a integrity tool. But the thing that's unpleasant about it is the integrity tool. You reboots the device when you run it. So there's no way to, you can't really look at the logs so much. You can try, but the only way to say, okay, has anybody, you might see, oh, this looks kind of like exploitation, but attackers have started using, they've been loading an implant tool called Sliver, which is actually the one I used in 2022 in my work. They've been loading that into these things. They've been putting different malware in there that keeps it persistent on the device. So if you think you're breached, you have to upload this tool and let your VPN device reboot. It's just not there's ways to do this that don't require a reboot. And I think that's probably a good segue into what you've got to talk about, Tyson.
Yeah, thanks so much. I'm gonna go back and share my slides again. Okay, so we went through the timeline. Let's talk a little bit about patching. So a lot of the things we saw in 2023 was there were a lot of 0 days, and it would be maybe 2 or 3 weeks before the vendor was able to roll out a patch, right? And even then, a lot of organizations, they're not able to patch on a dime like that. And why? So I think what I was showing here in with this headline from SC Media is it's from last year, and some researchers, they scanned the internet, they found 300,000 FortiGate firewalls were still unpatched, and this was a remote code execution attack. And the chart is from the NVD database, and it's just showing that the cadence of these vulnerabilities is not slowing down. It's getting worse. Like there's just more and more vulnerabilities coming out. And then like I was saying, now organizations may have, they're not able to patch, but guess who's able to exploit faster, right? Is the bad guys. So they're taking advantage of that window, to just kind of go to town. Do you want to?
Yeah. So this was an interesting one since we kind of beat up on PulseSecure a little bit. This is the first time that I've seen, and I think it is the first time that the government has actually told I mean, this was last week, right around this time, the CISA put out a thing basically telling every organism or every agency that is sort of under their purview that you basically have to unplug your Pulse Secure device by midnight Friday and essentially work the entire weekend to get this thing secured. Give me 1 second, sorry.
Sure. Yeah, no problem. I think I will say that Pulse Secure, Avanti wasn't able to get a patch out within. I think it took them like 3 weeks.
It took them multiple weeks. They had a mitigation that came out, but I think there was a Rapid7 blog that showed they're easy to bypass the mitigation. And if memory serves, it was because of a vulnerability in a third party, basically one of their supply chains, a third party package on the device had a vulnerability that had been patched back in, I want to say it was June of last year, but Avanti didn't take that patch. So the researchers were able to say, we can use this server-side request forgery vulnerability to bypass the mitigation, because the mitigation that Avanti put was essentially blocking certain API calls or API paths from being called from the internet. And so what they did is they were able to use a server-side request forgery thing to tell the Avanti to, similar to the F5 calls coming from inside the house, they were able to make the Avanti device talk to itself, bypassing the is it coming from the internet check, talk to itself to the vulnerable path, and then run the exploit and pop a shell back to the device in question.
Mm-hmm. So, I mean, why is it so difficult, Nate? Tell me. I mean, you come from
yeah,
a
I'm not gonna
background, right?
laundry list. I'm not gonna laundry list this, but as in my years doing this, we didn't, like I said, we wouldn't patch network gear unless we had to. I worked for Microsoft at one point. The team I was on, we had 68,000 pieces of networking equipment that we had to take care of. We weren't patching stuff unless it was absolutely necessary. But also in the 2007 to 14, 15 timeframe, there wasn't a lot of vulnerabilities. So we were just doing stability stuff or new functionality that we needed for whatever property we were supporting. But it also takes a lot more time, right? Because you're talking about, when we would say, okay, we need to patch a cluster that's handling Hotmail. There's 25 million users connected through this thing at any given time. You don't just reboot that. So there's all sorts of change windows. There's paperwork. You had to make sure that whatever data center you were going to fail the traffic over to had the capacity to do it. It was just a pain. It was a very long pain in the rear end. So we didn't, there was also the concern, and we saw this numerous times with pretty much every vendor, where we would take an upgrade to give this functionality we wanted, only to find out that they had changed some sort of behavioral thing inside the device. So the upgrade would go great, and then all of a sudden something would break, and then we've got an outage, and we've got to figure out what happened. And then, after hours or days dealing with the vendor, they're like, oh yeah, we decided to change the way it sends reset packets on timeout. And we didn't realize that it was going to DOS whatever system you had behind it when it sends 25 million reset packets in like 2 seconds. So that's the problem, right? These are not, it's not booting up, even patching like a domain controller. Well, you've got a whole bunch of them. You patch one and reboot it, nobody's going to notice. You patch a network device and it doesn't come back up. Things get bad really quickly when we're talking about like enterprise networking.
Blame the network.
Yeah, yes, they did.
Yeah. So what lessons are we taking away looking back, right? The title of the webinar is looking back to look ahead, or something like that.
Yeah.
What can we, what's the takeaways?
I guess the takeaways is that, and I'll kind of leave, I'm not, once again, not going to read the bullet points, but I think the takeaways is that we're going to see this get worse. It's going to get worse before it gets better, unfortunately. Obviously the nation states are going after it, but the ransomware gangs are going after it. I mean, it's trivial. I set up a Pulse device and I was able to craft the exploit in under a minute. I had it custom tuned for my device and I had a shell. This is not and the problem is there's so much technical debt that these vendors have. These devices are deployed by the million. If we talk about, the top 5 vendors and how many of these things are out there, there's millions of them. They're running old code. The architecture inside these things is missing basic protections like, stack canaries or ASLR or any of the memory safety stuff that we've seen that, that's just in Windows, it's in Mac, it's in your iPhone, it's in Linux. Even when these things are running Linux, they're generally running an older version of it. or they may, in some cases, they just don't turn that functionality on because they're like, it impedes performance. We have to have as fast access to memory. We don't want it randomized. And like I said, they're patching. They're not used to having to deal with this sort of flood of vulnerabilities. So the organizations, I mean, if we think about Microsoft in like 2000, 2001, everybody was screaming like Microsoft is terrible. I mean, I was a sysadmin-ish back then, and I was saying the same thing. It took Bill Gates telling the company essentially, we will fail if we don't get our stuff together and turn the ship around for security. They did it, right? They largely did it. And compared to 20 years ago, Windows is very safe now, very secure these days. But that was one company with sort of a stranglehold on their own ecosystem. Here we're talking about dozens of different companies, not nearly as well resourced as Microsoft. They may not care as much about how many of their customers are getting hacked, because at a certain point, I've had people say, okay, well, if this vendor isn't secure, what's the vendor I should go to? And I'm like, I don't have a good answer for you. Every single one, every vendor I could tell you to swap out has had their own vulnerabilities, and the ones that haven't had 0 days attacks, they're coming. Like it's the whole thing. Your companies have either been hacked or they don't know they've been hacked.
Yeah. We were discussing this MITRE white paper that came out that they put out in 2007, which is like more than 15 years ago, I think.
17.
Yeah.
They can almost vote.
These are 13 unforgivable vulnerabilities in 2007. What are we seeing in network devices today?
Most of these. So the first one, the Citrix bleed, was a buffer overflow. XSS, I know of a vendor that has a vulnerability that's like this. I can't mention actually 2 and 3. I know of a specific vendor that has these that I'm not going to name publicly. Remote file inclusion, that's what we use. That's what somebody did with Avanti, directory traversal, Citrix, Pulse, F5. World writable critical files, can't say off the top of my head. Direct request of administrator scripts, that was F5's 2022 vuln. Number 8, I know a vendor that I can't name that has that problem. Internal race symlinks. Some of these are somewhat Windows based. 12 is pretty common with IoT devices. And then 13 that's a lot of them. I mean, we see a lot of these, even the Fortinet stuff. A lot of these were stack overflows, buffer underruns, like things that are not coded with the safe coding that we've come to just assume is happening inside our operating systems. So yeah, most of these.
Which brings us to could be a hopeful analogy. We've seen the dire state of network devices today, and how attackers are taking advantage of these they're really supply chain vulnerabilities. I think it was in the 60s, Ralph Nader put out a book, Unsafe at Any Speed, talking about the designed-in dangers of the American automobile. Cars were just very unsafe. I think it was the Chevrolet Corvair. I think it had an engine in the back, which was problematic, and then also, I think it needed like aftermarket sway bars or something to keep it from just kind of not steering very well. So out of that came Volvo. They were able to do pretty well in the market by differentiating themselves on their product safety. Volvo was the company to get the patent on the 3-point seatbelt, and they gave it away for free, if I remember correctly. They made safety a priority, and they appealed to customers on that basis. And eventually, Congress did get in. They put together the National Highway Traffic Safety Administration that did crash test ratings, and with this transparency into automobile safety, consumers were then able to make purchase decisions based on the safety of those products, at least in terms of crash tests. And as a result, here, what we're seeing is while the overall number of fatalities has not dropped too much, is in the last 40 years or so, but the number of fatalities, the rate per million vehicles miles traveled, I believe it is that VMT acronym. So the Americans are driving more. We're on the road more. We're driving around more, but the rate at which people are dying has gone down, largely because of things like safety belts and just cars are a little safer. So, can the same thing be done in, for enterprise IT? And I want to show quickly a product that that Eclipsium is working on. This is the Eclipsium Guide to Supply Chain Security, and it's currently in early access. If you go to our website, and I will provide the link later, but if you go to our website and click on Supply Chain Intelligence and go down to the bottom, you can actually sign up for this early access program, and we have different classes of devices here. Here I've clicked on network devices. We only have Cisco in our catalog right now, but here what we're doing is basically we're looking at the different components of the device, and such as the firmware and things like that. And then we're looking at the security advisories from the vendor and the vulnerabilities in those components, and we're providing you with a risk score. So this is basically that type of intelligence that companies need in order to make risk-informed purchase decisions. Now, I understand that it's not super easy to just rip out all your network gear, but next time you're in the market for you should talk to Eclipsium. We have some we may be able to help you. And this I just wanted to provide the audience quickly a look at our flagship platform, supply chain security platform. And this is looking at your assets in production. And you can see here, I'm clicking on network devices. We do cover a number of network devices, and then we can not only show you the vulnerabilities, but also things, give you, information around the state of the firmware, and we can detect threats. Nate, do you just want to talk really quickly about types of how we do that threat detection?
Yeah, the threat detection is, without getting into too much into detail, what we do is we go in and we baseline what your firmware looks like when your device is brand new. We can look and say, okay, does what your firmware what you're running in your network match what the vendor would have sold? And then the idea is, and I apologize. The idea is that it's pretty much impossible to detect a 0-day, right? Nobody knows what an exploit looks like until it happens, but we do know that the common TTPs of an attacker is to exploit a 0-day, drop a web shell, drop a C2 implant, start tampering with binaries. So there's going to be some sort of changes made to the device that allows them persistent access. And so that's what we look for, is we say, okay, if all of a sudden a new PHP file shows up in the path of the web GUI of your Citrix device, that's something you probably want to know about. It says, we don't necessarily say you've been breached, but it gives you some sort of signals intelligence that says, that's not normal. Let me go take a look. And then if you find, okay, well, this looks like a web shell, now okay, it's time to call Citrix, it's time to call Mandiant or whoever and say, okay, or call us, although we don't do IR the way that Mandiant does.
Right. So this could be, while, we may be locked in, a lot of us may be locked into our network gear, but we can use Eclipsium as sort of a compensating control so that we have a layered defense. There's at least you won't get owned for 18 months and not know it. So, cool. So yeah, I do have the URL for that early access sign up here at the bottom, and yeah, that's all the slides we have. Melissa, did we have any questions come in?
Yeah, give me just 1 second here. We did have a couple come in. So one of them, I feel like it might have been addressed, but just so we cover it again, it says, why are ransomware groups shifting their behavior to target network devices? I think we did cover it, but just to make sure we cover that it's again.
Yeah, they're targeting it because it's a good place to set up shop. You don't get caught. It's hard. There's no AVR, there's no AV, there's no EDR. These devices do very little logging that tells you that something is going wrong security wise. And it also it affords you access to do things like if they decided, I mean, most of these gangs like Lockbit, say what you will about them, they are honest in the sense that when you pay the ransom, they give you your stuff back. They don't generally double dip and ransomware you a second time. But gangs could, in theory, say, I'm going to ransomware you once. If you don't find them on the network device, they sell that access to someone else, or they ransomware you and then sell the access to somebody who wants to just steal your data. But it's mostly that it's really hard to catch people there. That's why they like it.
Yeah. Yeah.
Okay, one more here. We have, how does Eclipsium actually detect the threats in network devices?
I think we covered that one. So hopefully that person they got their answer.
Yeah, we cover it from the sense of detecting things that shouldn't be there. We also have the ability to, if our platform detects something weird, we can pull it back and analyze it and say, okay, this looks malicious. We know that there are some techniques that attackers use that they will drop binaries on devices that should never actually exist in languages like in specific like programming languages that are not used on those things. Like, for example, Sliver is written in Go. F5 and Citrix don't use anything that's Go based on their devices. So if all of a sudden a Go binary shows up on a device, that's not normal, right? We also can look at publicly disclosed IOCs for specific log messages, for hashes of known pieces of malware. I'm not a real big fan of known hashes because it's easy to just recompile it. But we take everything that we can get from the public IOC world, as well as the expertise that we have in-house to try to detect these threats.
Another one come in, it says, it's possible some ransomware groups are proxies for nation states. Have you researched various trends to identify any commonalities?
I don't do the attribution. I have a lot of friends at like SentinelOne and Mandiant that they spend their lives doing this, so I don't do it that much. But the joke that a lot of us have is that when Ryuk gets off work, or I should say when Sandworm gets off work in the Russian ministry, they moonlight as Ryuk. There is a lot of overlap in the techniques that the ransomware gangs and the Russian state actors have. But I don't know. I don't know that anybody has definitively been able to say this guy is a state actor and a ransomware gang. Although I would suspect they probably drank at the same bars.
I will. One person that I follow for ransomware news is Alan Liska at Recorded Future, and he's called the ransomware sommelier. So he has a lot of good intelligence on ransomware. So I would check out what he has to say if he has anything to say about that.
Great. Well, that looks like that concludes the Q&A chat bot. I did want to just remind everybody that yes, we did record the session and we will be making a PDF of the slides available. So you'll be seeing an email from me here in the next day or so. And I want to thank both Nate and Tyson for joining us today. This was, again, one of the great webinars, and let you know that we do have our next webinar coming up on February 27th. I'll include a link to register for there. We're going to be talking about the recent shim vulnerability that we just posted a blog post on. So look forward to seeing you on the next webinar. Thank you, everyone.
Thanks, everyone. Be safe out there.